We're born curious. We were created to be. We ask, we question, we learn and grow. We've always been explorers, adventurers, dreamers and innovators, asking what, how and why. And there's so much more to explore together. New stories, new adventures, new loves, new joy. We're born curious. Stay curious. Try Alpha.
Good morning, Life Church. Thanks for being here today in Wilton and in Cedar Rapids and online as well as here in Coralville. We're glad that you're here. This video was from the Alpha course. If you've never heard of Alpha, that's okay. We've done kind of an abbreviated version of it here around Iowa City, in Coralville and in Tiffin. Alpha is an introductory course that teaches the basics of our Christian faith through asking questions. Each week we tackle a different question, like, is there more to life than this? Who is Jesus? Why and how should I pray? And one of the best things about Alpha is that it always includes a free meal. So you come, you all enjoy dinner together, you watch the video with that week's question, and then you divide into table groups to discuss. And it's a safe place to say anything, to disagree with the teaching, to be unsure, to have even more questions. And we're going to be doing Alpha here inside Coralville campus, inside the church, beginning September 10th. So I would encourage you all, no matter which campus you regularly attend, to consider being a part of it. We'll talk more about that later. But the best part about the Alpha curriculum is that it recognizes our profound need as human beings to ask questions. It welcomes them and honors them. And that's what we want to do here at Life Church, because it's not cultural or generational, our desire to ask questions. It's part of our DNA. It's who we are. You only need to know one toddler to know that that is true, because what do toddlers always ask? Yeah, why? 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 We need to know. Inquiring minds want to know. We have this innate desire within us to understand, and we feel frustrated or even like our rights are being trampled upon when our questions aren't answered sufficiently for us. I remember when my husband and I were planning our wedding, I would do something like, I would ask him, babe, and we have a wedding photo here. Yeah, I would ask him, babe, do you want to wear a boutonniere, like a flower on your suit for the wedding? And he would say, I can wear a boutonniere. I know you can. I'm asking if you want to. My question was not answered sufficiently for me. Or I will never forget this because I learned a valuable lesson that day. It was a few days before the wedding, and my parents and I were at the church with the church wedding planner man, just looking at everything that needed to be done, and Josh couldn't be there, so I texted him saying, babe, the day before the rehearsal, we have this, this, and this we need to set up. Can you please be here at this time, et cetera, et cetera. And he texted me back saying that he has to get a haircut that day, and he has to be at his aunt's house at 5. Now I know that my husband is the best person on the planet, always willing to help anyone, to do anything. I married up, I know that. So what I now know is that he meant, sure, absolutely, whatever you need. I'm just letting you know about these other commitments so that we can plan accordingly. But what I heard at the time, because he didn't say that, was, no way, dude, couldn't care less. You'll have to deal with that yourself. I'm busy. My question was not answered in a way that was sufficient for me. Now I know to always give my husband the benefit of the doubt because he's the best, but I didn't do that day. God made us to ask questions and seek answers. Usually it's to things that are more important than wedding planning, though it seemed supremely important to me at the time. There are 307 questions asked of Jesus in the Bible. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 187 if you don't count the same question asked in a different gospel account. And Jesus answers maybe 8 of them in any kind of direct way. There are 2 reasons for that. One, A lot of times it was the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, trying to trap him with their questions. You can't trap God. So he would either ignore the question or more likely turn it on its head and give it back to them. The other reason Jesus answered questions in an indirect way is that he wanted the people asking those questions to reach the answer through spirit-led reflection. In other words, no easy way out, no shortcut. He offered insights to those seeking understanding that would help them find the answers that lead them to God. That's why he often used parables, stories, to answer a question. Basically, he's not letting anyone off easy. He doesn't give straight answers. He asks more questions to get people where they needed to be. And Jesus asked a fair amount of questions. He asked 305 questions between the 4 gospel accounts, 135 distinct and different ones. And there are 2 kinds of questions. There are informational questions and transformational questions. An informational question is helping the asker learn something about the person being asked. What's your name? How old are you? Things like these are informational. Then there's transformational question. And the aim there is to help the one being questioned know themselves or the asker better. So a transformational question is always for the benefit of the people being asked. And what kind of questions do you think Jesus asked? Right, they were all transformational. Jesus already has all the information. He doesn't need to ask us anything. But his questions are meant to transform and help us. So today, we're going to take a look at 3 questions that Jesus asked. He asked them all of the Apostle Peter, and they are, why did you doubt? Who do you say I am? And do you love me? Peter is possibly my favorite character in the whole New Testament, except for Jesus. You may have heard him called Simon, or Simon Peter, or Cephas. They're all the same guy. He was a disciple and a close friend of Jesus. He wrote the biblical books of 1st and 2nd Peter. He was a Jewish fisherman, and he was kind of a hothead. Like, he was a passionate guy, but he often spoke or acted without thinking, and I can relate to that. He was kind of a rough and tough guy. He was also the default spokesperson for the disciples. So if anyone ever asked a question of the group, Peter was the one who would answer. You might remember him as the guy who cut the soldier's ear off when they were arresting Jesus. He was the first male, the first disciple to see Jesus alive after the resurrection. And years later, he was executed for his faith. He was crucified under Emperor Nero. So let's dive into our first question here, which is, why did you doubt? And we're going to be in the book of Matthew. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament, so if you're using an actual Bible instead of an app, good for you. It's right after that fancy page that says New Testament. Then you'll find the book of Matthew. We're in chapter 14. We're going to start in verse 22, and I'm using the NIV version here, so don't let it throw you off. Matthew 14:22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. Immediately, Jesus said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." All 4 Gospels contain this story of Jesus walking on water on the Sea of Galilee, but only Matthew includes the part where Peter gets out of the boat to come to him. And we don't know why that is. Matthew is the longest gospel. That could be why. He just talked more. Matthew and Peter weren't friends early in their relationship because Peter is Jewish and Matthew is a tax collector. Jewish people hated the tax collectors. So maybe Matthew's digging at his friend Peter here a little bit. We don't know. but Matthew's the only one that includes this bit about Peter walking on the water. Jesus is setting them up here for the miraculous. They've just right before this, seen him feed the 5,000 men plus women and children with just a lunch. And then he sends them off into the storm while he goes to pray. These guys are pretty comfortable on water, but we know that it was stormy and windy enough that the boat was already far from land and that Peter, a seasoned fisherman, was afraid. The Sea of Galilee, in fact, is known for its bad storms. It's 680 feet below sea level, so the water's really warm, but it's flanked by hills on all sides. So the cooler water rushes down the hills, mixes with the warmer air from the water, and it causes massive storms. You know, like a tornado when the cold air and the warm air come together. Same idea. So it's known for its bad weather, the Sea of Galilee. So the disciples are afraid, they're wet, they're cold, they're tired, they're wondering if they should try to head back the other direction or if they might even drown. It's the darkest part of the night, so it's kind of amazing that they could even see through the darkness and the rain and the wind. But they do all of a sudden see a ghost, or they think it's a ghost. They're terrified and they cry out in fear, but Jesus says, "Take courage, don't be afraid, it's me, I'm here." And even though they've seen him do many miracles, they're doubting because nobody can walk on water. So Peter, the spokesperson for the group, remember, says, "If it's really you, tell me to walk on the water as well." They think it's more likely to be a ghost than Jesus. Judaism doesn't have a belief in ghosts. But if it's really you, tell me to walk on the water as well. "Come," Jesus calls him. So Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking on the stormy sea toward Jesus. It's an amazing and beautiful, miraculous moment. The other disciples are still in the boat. In the Chosen episode of this story, we hear John say, "How is this the second most amazing thing I've seen today?" So Peter gets close enough almost to touch Jesus, and then just for a second, he looks away and notices how precarious his situation is. The wind and the waves and the storm, and he becomes afraid, and he starts to sink, and he lifts his head above the water just for a moment and cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus does. He reaches down, grabs his hand, catches him, and pulls him close. "You're okay, Peter. You're safe. I'm here." So on top of all his fear, Peter must feel like an epic failure. For all his big talk, he didn't have the faith he thought he did. So Jesus looks him in the eyes and says, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" They climb back in the boat. Jesus calms the storm. They all worship him, saying, "You are the Son of God." If all the miracles they've seen up to this point weren't enough to convince them, this is. When they get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, people immediately recognize Jesus, and they start bringing their sick and injured to him, and busy life and ministry goes on. But in the middle of this scene, in the middle of the storm, Jesus stops to ask a question. He's set up this whole thing for the benefit of the disciples, to increase their faith. He didn't just finish praying and then say, "Oh, well, the fastest way to get to them is just to walk on water." No, this was his plan all along. A.W. Tozer says, "Everything God does has purpose and intention behind that design. It's a master design, and every little thing has its proper place and function." It's just working out exactly how Jesus thought. He knew Peter would respond this way. He calls Peter, "You of little faith," which in the Greek means lacking confidence. Jesus uses the phrase 4 times in the book of Matthew, "You of little faith." We can't look at them all today, so that's your homework. Go find the other 3 times in the book of Matthew that Jesus uses that phrase. But Peter's the only one who was willing to get out of the boat. So I don't think Jesus is calling him, "You of little faith," to dig at him. That doesn't sound like Jesus anyway. I think Jesus is calling Peter, "You of little faith," to indicate the difference between Peter, who used to be a man of no faith, and Peter, who will become a man of great faith. Little faith is all we're asked to have anyway, right? Like a mustard seed. And we all know it's not the size of your faith, it's the size of the one you have faith in. He asks him, "Why did you doubt?" And Peter doesn't respond because it's a rhetorical question. It's like Jesus is saying, "Ask yourself, Peter, why did I doubt?" That initial faith, that excitement, that first step out of the boat can be a lot easier to produce. I want to walk on water. Call me to you, Jesus. I can do it. I trust you. But it's the continuing when you see the wind and the waves that it gets difficult. It's easier to trust Jesus will hold you on the water while you're still in the boat. Once we're out there, though, our true feelings come out, and Jesus knows this. He knows all this. He doesn't need Peter to tell him, but Peter needs to know for himself. Here's another reason I love Peter. His motives are layered, complicated. Mine are too. Peter loves Jesus, and yet he sees opportunity for selfish advancement among the disciples. He has faith, but he has doubt. He knows Jesus is Lord and is the one that can save him from drowning, but his faith and his resoluteness will be tested over and over again the longer he follows Jesus. Basically, it's easier to raise your hand and commit yourself to God in the worship service on Sunday morning, but maybe not as much on Friday night out with your friends or in the middle of the work week, chatting to your coworkers. But it's that long obedience in the same direction that's the challenge of faith. Jesus knows this. He understands it well. So it's out of compassion and empathy and a desire to see Peter and us trust him more the next time that he asks, why did you doubt? 2 chapters later, Matthew 16, who do you say I am? Jesus is condemning the untruths of the Pharisees, and he's frustrated that the disciples think he's just talking about bread when he uses the analogy, the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's trying to make a point about the difference between truth and lies, and the disciples think he's talking about a recipe, and he says, how can you still not get it? They stop to rest at a place called Caesarea Philippi. It's in northern Israel. It backs up to Mount Hermon. They worship the god Pan there, among others, and it is a spiritually dark place, a spiritually extreme place where most people at the time thought you could find the gates of hell. So this is where Jesus chooses to ask the disciples a question. In Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 13 and going to verse 20. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. This is a weird little scene. Strange and yet weighty, like a lot was decided here. A line drawn in the sand. You have to decide, you have to declare, who am I? You can't sit on the fence anymore. Jesus asks the disciples who the Son of Man is. Son of Man comes from the Old Testament, from the book of Daniel as well as others, and it indicates permanence and exaltedness, and it was Jesus' preferred title for himself. And basically the answer is there was little agreement among the people of Israel about who he is. But basically they thought he was a dead guy, a dead man of God. Just depends how far back they felt you needed to go to find one. John the Baptist had just recently died, but Jeremiah and Elijah were long gone. So this was the general thinking of the time on who Jesus was. Mitzi Smith is a New Testament professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. She writes, people identified the Son of Man with dead prophets sent by God who did miraculous deeds, who stood toe-to-toe with kings and delivered to them words of doom, opposition, and hope from Yahweh. Yahweh means God. Not bad company to be in, but clearly not the full scope of who the Son of Man is. So Jesus goes on, okay, all right, fine, but who do you say I am? The 12 people closest to him in the whole world, who do you say I am? And of course, our spokesperson, Peter, answers, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Some translations use Christ instead of Messiah, but they both mean anointed one, chosen and declared by God to be the fulfillment of his promise. Set apart, the Savior and the Liberator. In other words, Peter has the right answer. Peter has understood the assignment, and so Jesus blesses him. He observes that Peter didn't come to this conclusion on his own. He gets it from above. He declares him Peter, which means rock. And on this rock of truth that Peter has declared will Jesus build his church, his assembly, if you will. Ecclesia in the Greek, if you recognize the book of Ecclesiastes, same word. And the Gen Z Bible says that hell is not going to stand a chance against it. Then Jesus goes on to say some kind of confusing things about keys and things being bound and set free on earth and in heaven, and who knows what that means. And Mitzi Smith again writes, the heavens are witnesses of the people and things that we imprison and the people and things that we set free. What we do on earth matters, and it has an impact in the heavens and in the atmosphere around us. Jesus is giving them and us a lot of power here. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you set free on earth will be set free in heaven. And then he says, don't tell. He tells them not to tell anyone that he's the Messiah. And one can't help but wonder how they're supposed to build this church so strong that hell won't stand a chance against it if they can't tell anyone. Plus, pretty soon he's going to tell them to tell everyone. So how will they do it? It'll be through their lives. Their lives will speak louder, more truthfully, more effectively than their words. Their words will come into play at some point, but the answer is they will build their church by the life they live, a life of love for God, a life that loves the other as much as we love ourselves, a life in pursuit of justice and peace. On this rock, he will build it. He's still building it. He's still building the church on that rock of truth, but now he's using us. But he can only do that once we've answered the question, who do you say I am? Last one. Jesus has died. They know he's been resurrected, but he hasn't yet ascended. He hasn't gone back to be with the Father. It wasn't really all that safe for the disciples to be seen together right now with their leader recently executed, but they can't help it. They're family now. So they're hanging out together. And Peter, with Jesus recently crucified, has gone back to his old job as a fisherman. So he goes out fishing, and the others come along. They catch nothing all night. And in the morning, Jesus is waiting for them on the shore. They don't recognize him at first until he tells them where they can go to catch fish. They do it, and they catch so many fish that their nets should break, but they don't. That's when Peter realizes who this is, and he's so happy. It's his best friend Jesus on the shore. He just jumps out of the boat, not a care in the world, and just starts swimming toward Jesus on the shore. Jesus cooks breakfast from those fish they caught, and they all enjoy it together. John 21, verses 15 through 19. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. There are so many beautiful things about this scene. Unlike our other passages today, it's only found in the Gospel of John. And we can see quite clearly from the context that that's because John was the only other one there. After breakfast, the other disciples fade into the background. I think they went to clean all those fish, but we don't know. Peter and Jesus are having this intimate moment, and after these verses, it becomes clear that John is like eavesdropping in the background, that he saw the beauty of this moment. It was precious to him, and he had to include it before he closes his gospel, which he does right after this. But you're going to need some background first for any of this to make sense and to see just how beautiful it really is. So stay with me. Mark 14, the Last Supper. Jesus is letting the disciples know that he's going to die. He's about to die, and they will all abandon him and fall away when that happens. Peter, true to form, full of zeal and quick to speak, reacts strongly to this. And in Mark 14, 29 and 30 says, Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And Jesus is right. In Luke 22, though it can be found in other places, Jesus is on trial before the high priest. Peter's following at a distance. It's late at night now, and the people milling around the trial build a fire and sit around it, including Peter. 3 different times, people recognize him and ask him, "Aren't you one of those guys that was with Jesus?" And 3 times Peter denies it, saying, "I do not know him." In Luke 22, 60 to 62, but Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. At that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Suddenly, the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. "Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." And Peter left the courtyard, weeping bitterly. Oh, how that must have stung. I feel it like right here. Do you feel that? Have you ever betrayed someone you loved and immediately felt such regret at that betrayal? But then in the midst of his trial, Jesus looks over at him just at that moment, knowing what had happened. We have a picture of an artist's rendition of how it might have been, because it's hard for me to visualize. It was like an open-air courtyard kind of thing, where the trial was going on. Jesus is on trial for his life. Here's Peter with some other dudes milling around outside. They've built a fire, and even though Jesus is on trial for his life, his mind is on Peter. And the second that Peter denies him, that 3rd time that he does exactly what he predicted, Jesus looks over. And Peter realizes, and he leaves weeping bitterly. And in that moment, Peter discovers that everything he thought about himself was wrong. He's not the loyal, passionate, fearless Christ follower he thought he was. He's a fraud. He's a liar. He's a betrayer, an abandoner, and a traitor 3 times over. So it's around another fire, absolutely on purpose, not by accident. It's around another fire that Jesus chooses to ask his questions, that it gets to the heart of the issue, that we see Peter take responsibility, achieve a new level of self-awareness, and be restored, reinstated, if you will, by Jesus. 3 times he denied him, just as Jesus predicted. So 3 times Jesus asks him the question, "Do you love me?" Can't you picture that loving look in Jesus' eyes as he asks the 3rd and final time, "Do you love me?" It's like he's erasing the sins of Peter's past. I hope you know this morning how good Jesus is at erasing the sins of our past. "Yes, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you," Peter replies. And 3 times Jesus follows with the response, "Then feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs." And Peter does. He spends the rest of his life sharing the gospel, growing the kingdom, and taking care of the church, us, the sheep. He becomes a hero of the faith, and as predicted by Jesus here, he dies for that faith. All because of Jesus' pointed, grace-filled, transformational question that pushes him forward. Do you love me? Why did you doubt? Who do you say I am? Do you love me? Transformational questions that Jesus uses to change Peter's life and character and push him to the man Jesus wants him to be. The great news here is that Jesus doesn't just use his own questions to do that. He can use ours as well. I bet everyone in this room has at one time or another asked Jesus a question that they felt desperately needed an answer. When my mom was close to dying, we have a picture, I think, of me and my mom. My parents came to visit me when I lived in Oaxaca, so that's me and my mom. When she was close to dying, I found myself flying pregnant across the country to say goodbye to her for the 2nd time. I had done this before. She was in Kansas City, where I'm from. We were in Boston. And when I was pregnant with Pippa, our oldest, she had a bovine valve replacement in her heart and was circling the drain. And they called my husband and I to come and say goodbye to her. And I sat by her bedside for hours and days. Jesus, please do not take her yet. Please do not take her yet. And he didn't. He gave her 2 more years. It was a miraculous recovery. It was a long road. She was never quite the same, but she did get that extra time, and she got to meet Pippa and become a grandma. And when I was pregnant with Phoebe, our youngest, she started to not feel well. And a stubborn lady that she was didn't want to go to the doctor. So by the time my dad finally convinced her to go to the doctor, she was dead within the week from the tumor, the inoperable tumor that was cutting off her airway. So we flew across the country again to say goodbye. She was asleep by the time we got there, so I never got to hear her voice again, but I did get to say goodbye, and within 8 hours of our plane landing, she was gone. And I couldn't really take it in at that point, what was happening, that I would never talk to my mom again. I was pregnant. We were moving to Iowa, of all places. Where is Iowa? I just had other things going on. And so it was many months later, crying in our living room in Coralville, feeding baby Phoebe in the middle of the night, that I finally asked Jesus, why? Why have you done this? Why did you have to take her? It's never okay to lose a parent or anyone you love, but it is a unique kind of grief to lose your mom as a young mom. If you've experienced it, you know what I mean. Why? What glory could this possibly bring you, Jesus? I didn't really get an answer to my question. God honors our questions, but he doesn't always answer them, does he? At least not the way we'd prefer. But I did feel in that moment, and in many moments since, the overwhelming awareness of Jesus saying, I know. I got you. We're in this together. And I continue to get that answer. Even just this last week at Kid Venture, Deep Sea Bible Time was back here. The amazing teachers were teaching about the resurrection and celebrating things about the resurrection. So Lori would say something about the resurrection in a quiet voice, and then everyone would cheer because we're so happy celebrating. And at one point, she said, "Death is not forever." And all the kids cheered, and I felt that so deeply in my heart. Death is not forever. Since we moved to Iowa 6 years ago, I've lost my mom, my dad, my grandma, and my uncle. But death is not forever, and that answer is enough for now. What questions do you have for Jesus this morning? Maybe it's, when will you bring healing, provide a new job, bring me a spouse? Maybe it's, why did this horrible thing, XYZ horrible thing, have to happen? Maybe it's, what are you doing in my life, Lord? What should I be doing? These are all valid questions. Some I'm pretty sure he's going to answer, and some I'm pretty sure he won't. Not this side of heaven anyway. But now, in light of Jesus' questions for Peter, in light of your questions for Jesus, ask yourself one. What is Jesus calling me to today? What is my next step? We all have one. Whether this is your first or second Sunday here, or you were a part of the team that built Life Church, or you've been doing this Christian thing for 50 years, we all have a next step. If you're here in Coralville, maybe it's helping with Alpha. We need people to take the course. If you're a new Christian or a non-Christian, that's you. We need people to be table leaders. We need people to make all that free food. Maybe Jesus is calling you to that. If you're not here in Coralville, hey, Wilton and Cedar Rapids, so many of you were here for Kid Venture. This is just one night a week. You can still make it. Not everything has to do with Alpha. I'm a little single-minded right now, but maybe your next step is getting baptized. Here in Coralville, we have them next week, but we're going to do in all 3 campuses baptism on the same day on October 13th. But I don't think Jairus and Rafi would make you wait that long if you were excited about getting baptized. Maybe your next step is simply bringing your questions to the feet of Jesus and seeing what will happen. Someone once said, one who never asks either knows everything or knows nothing. I can't promise that Jesus will answer your questions, but I can promise he will welcome them and honor them and walk with you in their tension, because this is who Jesus is. This is Jesus. As I pass it back to the campus pastors, would you stand with me? If you felt God calling you to a very specific next step today, will you please use the QR code to scan that little spot in front of you, on the chair in front of you that says next steps, so that we can know about it, so that we can support you in that, all right? We're going to have prayer teams on the left and on the right. If you need prayer this morning for anything, we would love to pray with you. And let me all just tell you that there is a table about Alpha back there in the lobby. If you want to learn more about it or have any questions, don't hesitate to stop there either. You're not committing to anything. Would you pray with me? God, thank you for being the God of second chances and new beginnings and questions still waiting to be answered. And thank you that the day will come when everything will be made clear and you will answer those questions, God. And everything will make sense. And you will wipe every tear from our eyes and death will be no more. Thank you for honoring and sitting with our questions in the meantime, God. And thank you that you never feel angry or annoyed at us for bringing those questions to you. Thank you for being who you are, Jesus. Speak your truth to our heart this morning and let us carry it with it throughout the day. In Jesus' name. And everyone said, amen.